Hi, welcome to Speaking of Mysteries. I'm Bruce Southworth, the mystery reviewer for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. My guest today is James Lee Burke, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. James Lee Burke is probably best known for the Dave Robicheaux series set in Louisiana, and now also the Billy Bob Holland series, which are generally set in the Texas area. In the past, he's won 2 Mystery Writers of America Edgar Awards, one for Cinnamon Rose and one for Black Cherry Blues. He's had a Pulitzer Prize nomination for the book The LOST GET BACK BOOGIE, and he's also been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. So welcome, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Bruce.
Well, your most recent book is Bitterroot, a Billy Bob Holland novel, and perhaps what we could start with is if you wouldn't mind just kind of summarizing the plot of the novel. I know it's got a lot of complicated things going on, but...
Well, Bitterroot is the 3rd novel in a trilogy narrated by an ex-Texas Ranger turned defense attorney by the name of Billy Bob Holland. Bitterroot is set in Montana, in the western part of the state, the Bitterroot Valley and up the Blackfoot, along the Clark Fork of the Columbia River. It's the area where I live, my wife and I live, half the year. I've been around there since 1966. It's a remarkable area, but that's where the book is set. It's my tribute to Montana, I guess.
There's a lot of interesting things that go on in that book, and quite a collection of characters, and I want to get into talking about some of those a little bit. But the Holland family, though, I mean, if this is the 3rd in a trilogy, the Holland family has been featured in previous books, though, so in a way this is more of a continuation, like a family saga.
It is. The Hollands are based on my mother's family, the Hollands. And the first novel in the series, CIMARRON Rose, was based in part upon my great-grandfather's journal. He was a drover by the name of Sam Morgan Holland, and a gunfighter. And he had his problems with violence and whiskey, but he became a saddle preacher eventually. But anyway, this novel, which concludes the trilogy, deals with the protagonist and ultimately his renunciation of violence, which had become for him an addiction on the same level as in severity as the addiction to alcohol or narcotics.
I noticed an awful lot of, I'm going to try and combine things here, I noticed an awful lot of similarity. There's many differences, but there's an awful lot of similarity between Billy Bob Holland and your other main character, Dave Robicheaux. I mean, they both are haunted by a variety of ghosts. They have a law background. They're both dealing with a tendency toward violence. Was that kind of intentional, or are they sort of just essentially the same kind of people in 2 different settings?
Well, they both share the characteristics of the tragic and Promethean protagonist. And it's my own feeling that great dramatic art, I'm not saying that mine necessarily is, but great dramatic art ultimately takes us back to both the Elizabethan stage and Greek theater during the golden age of Pericles, and the Aristotelian view of the tragic protagonist. He possesses the virtues which we admire most in people, courage and stoicism and compassion, but he's flawed in some way, usually by hubris. And it's he who precipitates his own undoing. And that's how he differs from the protagonist we meet in, say, A Study in Pathos, where the main character is acted upon. He's passive. Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman is not tragic, but rather one whom we pity.
Right, he's not in essence in kind of control.
That's
driving
correct.
is either success or failure.
That's correct.
In that sense. Let me ask you a little bit about, getting away from more of the theory, but a little bit about the genre. I was reading some conversation on the internet, and your books came up, and people were arguing over whether or not you would be considered a Texas writer or not. I'm kind of wondering where you'd fall on that, or if you find those labels just sort of useless to start with.
Well, I've been called worse. I've answered to worse.
A Texas writer's not so bad then.
But I think maybe all writing in some way, particularly American writing, is in some way regional. But writing that is going to endure has to transcend. It has to be greater than a regional story. So, again, a truly great writer, someone such as William Faulkner, for example, might write about what he called a little small postage stamp of experience in northern Mississippi. But it's the story that's emblematic of us all. Just as Shakespeare might have written about Elizabethan England or medieval England. But the story remains unchanged. It applies as much to us today, the story of Hamlet, as it did to the people who sat in the Globe Theater 4 centuries ago.
How about the notion in the kind of writing that you do? I've been reading reviews and commentary, and one of the most common phrases is you're extending the genre, that being the crime fiction genre, or you're really sort of pushing that envelope a little bit. Again, maybe the label of a crime fiction writer doesn't quite apply to you. I think I've heard you say in one time that you're not really, consider yourself a mystery writer or a crime fiction writer, but more of a, just a novelist whose books happen to contain crime. Is that something you actually said, or am I just remembering it funny?
Well, I probably didn't say that.
Okay.
But I might have implied something that is similar. I think a writer's best letting others characterize his work. I don't take my own inventory very accurately, I suspect. But my own feeling is that art has to be greater than any one category. And it's in the nature of journalism to put things in shoeboxes, because I used to be a journalist. A story is a very short medium, a few column inches, and so you have to kind of use broad strokes. And so art tends to be placed in shoeboxes sometimes. But in truth, I don't know much about what is called mystery writing, because I never read very many of them. The only change that I made in my work when I wrote the Dave Robicheaux novels is that I used a first-person narrator who was sometimes a police officer. Robicheaux is not always a policeman in the novels. He's always having trouble and being dismissed from the sheriff's department there in New Iberia. But the story, in order to be any good, has to deal with something larger than crime. And ultimately, all great drama is about the struggle between good and evil. See, no one ever calls Dog Soldiers a crime or mystery novel. It won the National Book Award, the story by Robert Stone about the heroin trade in Vietnam. We don't think of The Pope of Greenwich Village as a crime novel, but it's one of the best novels written about criminals I know of in American literature. So it's a matter of definition. I think the term mystery writing is often used derogatorily. It becomes a pejorative usage. That's what bothers us, see? Whereas there are mystery writers who write very good prose, who do things that other writers do not. I think the story in L.A. Confidential, like the film adaptation and much of the book, has enormous skill, and it's very artfully done. The recreation of the times. The sense you have in the book that something almost culturally cannibalistic is at work here. The real antagonists are not bad cops or wise guys or Mexican zoot suiters, as they were called in the late 40s, but something far more insidious and pervasive in the American culture. It's like a hedonism on acid that has pervaded an entire culture. It's Los Angeles. It's the La Brea tar pits gone amok. It's not coincidence that people like Charlie Manson and any number like him all come from the same part of the country.
Yeah, that's true.
They all have the same zip code.
Well, you know, the same could be said, and you touch on it so well in Bitterroot too, that, you know, that Montana draws its own kind of crowd.
Yeah.
And you know, there's some real interesting people there.
Oh yeah.
One of the themes that struck me, and I think the character in Bitterroot, Carl Hinkle, who's sort of this leader of this, I don't know what you'd call the group, militia group, yeah. But is kind of an overriding comparison, if you will, or discussion of the self-image, you know, sort of the real image of a person versus the public image of a person. And there are many instances, I think, in Bitterroot where you're contrasting what people are really like. Xavier Girard, for example, who's a writer living there, goes from both ends, where at one point he's boxing or, you know, doing some boxing workout kind of thing, and has this group of admirers standing around him. And later in the book, he's, you know, drunk and disheveled and vomiting in the street, you know, which is more accurate. So that kind of real versus public image is something that seems to be going through a lot of your books, actually. Is that a accurate description of an intent that you've got? I mean, is it one of the themes that you consciously put in?
Well, I think it's certainly a theme that people are not what they seem. And, of course, that's the skill required of the artist, ultimately. It's to show the person as he wishes to be shown, to indicate to the reader the other personality, the deeper personality that lies beyond the thespian. And it's just in the nature of human beings to wish, for whatever reason, to be something more or less than what they in reality are. Someone said there are three ways that we can look upon ourselves. We can accept our own perception, or the perception of others, or the perception of God, you see. So ultimately, the artist has to, in effect, have the perception of God. He has to look upon his characters with charity.
Kind of following along that thought, the perception of God toward the characters that you're creating, manipulating. Do you have that kind of omnipotent control over the characters, or do you find in this series or other books that you've written that they rather take on lives of their own?
Oh, they do, yeah. I think there's certain things the character should do, or I plan for him to do, but he does things I never anticipate.
Just not cooperating.
They take on lives of their own. That's absolutely correct. It's a strange kind of schizophrenic process, but I feel as writer that I'm almost witness to the behavior of the characters, the events in the novel, rather than their creator.
Do you have a sense of how everything is going to turn out, or is it as much a surprise for you as the reader?
Yeah, it's the latter. I never know where a book's going to go. I never do. I see a couple of scenes into it each day, but that's all.
How actually do you work when you write? As you do you just try and accomplish an amount that feels right, or X number of pages, or X number of hours? Or you?
Well, I shoot for 1,000 words in a day. I don't always get that. I've always worked a 7-day week. I start writing in the morning, write until I really can't do it very well any longer. Then I rework that writing the next day. Then I start the next scene.
Okay.
And so when I finish the novel, there's not much for me to change. I revise every day. There's not a day I don't revise. Then I write things out in longhand at night before I go to bed.
Oh, you're longhand.
At night.
At night?
At night I do. Before I go to bed, I usually write things down.
Kind of veer off a little bit. I wanted to ask you to comment on a quote from the book Bitterroot. This is Doc Voss commenting to Billy Bob, and he says, "Neither the weight of headstones nor our heartbreaking and vain attempts at recreating our first love would ever disallow the hold of the dead upon the quick." You expand on that a little bit and maybe put that in context?
Well, I think, is it Doc Voss who says that, or Billy Bob?
Well, Doc Voss says it first, and then Billy Bob echoes it later.
Yes. The passage alludes to the fact that primitive people put rocks on top of the graves of the dead. These rocks later became our headstones. But the purpose was to keep the dead in the ground. And of course, the military salute, the firing of rifles over the grave was it's the vestige of a very primitive ceremony in which primitive people would fire arrows into the air to ward off spirits from the grave
I had no
of
idea.
the dead person. That's where it comes from.
Oh.
So we're not quite that far from some of the rituals of our ancestors. But the point is that the dead lay claim on the living, the quick. That we, as modern people, like to think of ourselves as divorced from the past, but we're not. We are the culmination of the past. The dead are still with us, I think. As we see in these books, we meet specters. But I believe, probably that time all happens at once. That's my feeling. I don't think it's linear.
That's interesting. And maybe can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, it's only man who measures time sequentially. We create calendars out of our sun and the revolutions of the planet, but our solar system has nothing to do with time in the larger universe. And we cannot even contemplate the meaning of the words eternal or infinite. The human mind cannot have the idea of something that has neither beginning nor end. And if there is a God, and I believe there is one, why is it that his mind, his intelligence, and I think God probably is pure intelligence, and the world may be an emanation of that intelligence, but why should he be confined by past, present, and future? We can't enter into the former or the latter. We're bound by now. But God is certainly not. But sometimes, we hear stories about people who see apparitions. Old castles in London, Roman soldiers go walking through walls because there were Roman roads underneath the castle, that sort of thing. I believe there's an explanation. It's because all these things happen simultaneously. We're all inside eternity already. And that is the one absolute fact we know about ourselves. We are all inside eternity. And so, in some fashion, that fact is physiologically, anatomically undeniable. And atomically is the word I wanted there.
Okay.
But we're part of a much larger entity. So to think of it in calendar terms seems to me kind of something of a joke.
But keeping that in mind as you read the books, I mean, it I think would help kind of put in perspective Billy Bob's conversations with his best friend, L.Q. Navarro, who was killed many years ago in the linear sense, as well as in like the Electric Mists, the Confederate general.
Yeah, in the Electric Mist with Confederate Dead.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, that one, it was very, very evocative. I think it's one of mine as well. To more mundane matters, I'm curious. The first book you published, I believe, was in 1965. Was the date of it somewhere around in there?
65. I finished it in 1960, though.
Oh, okay.
I was 23.
How have you found the business of publishing books or being a writer? The business side of things has changed over that amount of time. Is it for the better, for the worse? Is it?
Depends on how you view it, but it's certainly changed dramatically. I think the big changes began and took on a great deal of permanence, in fact, in the 1970s. And American publishing, for good or bad, became far more corporate in nature. publishing houses, which were usually family-run enterprises, generationally maintained, were either they merged or were acquired by much larger media companies. And today there are almost no independent houses in New York anymore.
Yeah.
Most of them are owned by either American or European conglomerates. Quite a few are owned by European conglomerates. How that bodes for writing, it's good in some ways that the distribution, the power they have to do well for a good book is certainly increased exponentially. Sometimes the way things that are done are far removed from the kind of literary professionalism of years gone by. Sometimes publishing today gets very rough. It's much, put it this way, it's far more like the movie industry in the way it is conducted than it is like its antecedents of 30 or 40 years ago.
If you were just getting into the publishing business or the writing business now, would you, coming up with a kind of conglomerate view of things, would you kind of have second thoughts or still press on with it?
Oh, you never let the external consideration affect your art. There's always an upside and a downside to every situation, but it was always hard to publish. I think it is easier for some writers to publish today than it would have been for them 40 years ago.
Really?
It was really hard 40 years ago. I wrote Half of Paradise when I was 22 and 23 years old. It took me 4 years to find a publisher. I couldn't even get an agent back then. It was, in other words, the story has not changed. And then it was through a meeting with a fellow who had been in the Lincoln Brigade out in Los Angeles that I was introduced to an agent named Kurt Helmer, who sold my book to Hoot and Mifflin. They were my first publishers. But boy, it was really hard back then. And if you sold 5,000 copies back then, you were in tall cotton. You know, William Faulkner never sold more than 5,000 copies of one of his novels.
I didn't realize that.
It was Absalom, Absalom in 1933.
Huh.
He was totally out of print 1 year before he won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's just astounding.
So when people say it's hard today, it's no harder than it was back then. Now there's certain areas where the doors are not only open, there are people who make enormous sums of money, and frankly, they're not very good. I mean, there are guys making great livings today who 40 years ago would have
never made it.
They would have never made it. So, you know, I can say it's an upside. Maybe there's an upside to this story for guys who really should not be writing.
Well,
but that's not a very good conclusion to draw.
It's not a real upside for the general reading public. Yeah, this is very true.
No, there's a great deal of stuff published today that I don't think should be published. That are, and careers are sometimes manufactured. There are enormous advertising and promotional efforts sometimes expended on writers whose work I don't think, that's one guy's opinion, but at least I don't think merit that kind of a promotion by a publishing house. And often they lose their shirts. That's what's ironic, because you know, it's like a pitcher can go 3 innings. Isn't necessarily a guy that, you know, can go the full 9.
True. That's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah. The you know, I just totally lost my thought.
That's all right.
Let me just switch.
I do that several times a day.
I was going someplace really good with that too. You had said one time in an interview, and I don't remember where, that quote, if a writer convinces himself that he generated his talent out of his own willpower, he'll lose it. Would I take that to mean that now you taught English and so on, that you can actually teach technique, but there'd really better be something underlying it in order to...
Well, also, I meant by that quote, what you say is absolutely correct. A technique and a certain kind of devices can be taught, but talent is not acquired, nor is it learned. It's something that's God-given, in my view. But when a writer loses his humility about his gift, he doesn't lose a virtue, because humility is not a virtue with an artist. It's an imperative requirement, or he's not going to survive. But as soon as he begins to claim credit for the gift, to indicate to himself and to others that somehow he earned all of this, that's the day he loses the gift he has. It will be given to someone else. I've never seen the exception. When the artist finds himself using words like I, me, and mine, and myself, it's the bottom of the night. The stands are emptying out.
Well, we're kind of coming down to a close, but the one thing I kind of wanted to ask you, if you didn't have the gift that you had and were in it going to a completely different career, what would be the one field or career that you would pursue if it weren't writing?
Bank robbery.
Bank robbery. That's original. I like that. There's a fair amount of risk in that too, I guess. Yep.
I don't know. I don't know what I'd be. I think maybe I'd like to be an archaeologist.
An archaeologist would be fascinating, yeah.
Fly fisherman.
Fly
things
fisherman.
like that.
Yeah. Well, that's something I understand that you're very, very fond of.
Yeah, I do it quite a bit.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we've pretty much very quickly run out of time. I want to thank you so much for being my guest today. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for having me,
Thank you
Bruce.
very much.
I appreciate it.